The frontier was no place for the weak. The wilderness of the American West in the mid-1800s was a land of extremes, towering mountains blanketed in snow, dense forests alive with predators, rivers that could turn deadly in an instant, and plains that stretched endlessly beneath an unforgiving sky. Only the toughest souls could carve out an existence here. Among them was a solitary figure known by the few who had crossed his path. A mountain man named Elias Crow. Elias had lived in the high country for nearly a decade, far from towns, trading posts, and the comforts of civilization. He was a man, shaped by hardship, carrying with him the silence of the wild and the patience of someone who had faced storms and starvation alone. His cabin sat in a narrow valley, wedged between pine-covered ridges, where elk grazed and wolves howled under. The moon. Smoke rose from its chimney only when the weather grew cruel enough to force him indoors. Otherwise, Elias preferred the open air, his life measured by the sound of his rifle's crack and the strength of his traps set along the riverbanks. Those who met him described him as a man carved out of the very mountains he called home. Tall, broad-shouldered, his beard thick and streaked with early gray despite his age barely past 40. His eyes were sharp, a pale blue that seemed to see more than most men wished to reveal. He spoke little, often choosing silence over wasted words, but when he did speak, his voice carried the low thunder of authority, even if his intent was only to ask for a simple trade. Elias was no outlaw, nor did he seek trouble, yet his past remained cloaked in mystery. Rumors claimed he had once been a soldier, perhaps a trapper's apprentice, or even a man running from something darker back east. But the truth mattered little in the wild. What mattered was survival, hunting cleanly, fighting fiercely when necessary, and respecting the land that could feed or kill a man with equal ease. His days were disciplined, almost ritualistic. At dawn, he checked the snares and traps scattered through the valley. At midday, he hunted elk or deer, sometimes, fishing the icy rivers with a patience that could outlast any creature. By nightfall, he repaired his tools, skinned hides, and smoked meat to last through the long winters. To many, this life would have been a curse, loneliness pressing in like the cold. But for Elias, solitude was a shield. In the silence of the mountains, he found peace away from the quarrels of men. Yet the wilderness had its own voice, and it often reminded Elias that he was but a guest. The crack of a tree under snow, the distant cry of a mountain lion, or the eerie silence before a storm. These were warnings, lessons he never ignored. Nature could be generous, offering a bounty of game, but it could also be merciless, stripping a man of everything in a single night. And though Elias respected the land, he knew it respected no one in return. Occasionally, Elias crossed paths with native tribes moving through the mountains, the Crow, the Cheyenne, sometimes the Lakota. These encounters were always cautious, built on unspoken rules of mutual respect. He would offer tobacco, a pelt, or sometimes nothing more than space and silence. He admired their knowledge of the land, their ability to move through the forest like shadows. Though he lived apart, Elias felt more kinship with these tribes than with settlers who often treated the wilderness as something to be conquered rather than endured. Despite his self-reliance, Elias was not immune to the weight of loneliness. The nights, especially in winter, stretched long and heavy. The crackling of the fire often sounded too loud, echoing against the cabin walls, reminding him he had no one to share the silence with. He had buried friends long ago, lost to war, disease, or the endless hunger of the frontier. Perhaps this loneliness was why he kept a small wooden cross nailed above his cabin's doorframe, a reminder of something greater, or perhaps of the life he once knew before he disappeared into the mountains. It was in this state of rugged solitude that Elias's story truly began. For all his years of surviving storms, predators, and the relentless march of time, nothing had prepared him for what he was about to face. A simple choice, an act of compassion, would change everything. One cold evening, as the wind carried the scent of snow and the shadows of dusk stretched long, Elias was about to encounter someone who would shatter the stillness of his solitary life. A dying native widow, stumbling through the forest, desperate for help. And though Elias did not yet know it, by helping her, he would awaken forces greater than any storm, greater than any hunger, greater even than the loneliness that had defined him. The mountains had tested him before, but soon he would face a test unlike any he had ever known. The storm had rolled in faster than Elias expected. By late afternoon, the mountains were cloaked in a gray veil of clouds, and the first flakes of snow began tumbling silently from the sky. Elias tightened the strap of his fur coat and pulled his hat low as he trudged back toward his cabin, a bundle of firewood strapped across his shoulders. He had learned long ago never to underestimate the mountain's moods. What began as a gentle snowfall could, within an hour, become a raging white wall that swallowed the world whole. As he neared the bend in the trail that cut along the frozen creek, he paused. His ears, sharpened by years of listening to the wilderness, caught something unusual. It wasn't the creak of trees shifting under snow or the rush of wind through the pines. No, it was softer, weaker, a sound that did not belong to the forest. Moan. Elias set down the firewood and rested his hand on the worn stock of his rifle. He waited, silent as the snow fell around him, eyes scanning the woods. There it was again, a faint, trembling cry. Not the cry of an animal, but of a human in pain. Slowly, cautiously, he stepped off the trail, boots crunching softly in the snow. 100 paces into the trees, he saw her. A woman. She was collapsed against the base of a cedar tree. Her body, half covered in snow as if the storm itself had tried to bury her. Her hair, long and black as a raven's wing, was tangled and matted. Her face was pale, lips cracked, eyes half closed as she struggled to breathe. The clothes she wore were thin for the winter, torn and stained, though their beadwork and patterns told Elias she was no wanderer but a woman of the people, the natives who moved through these mountains. Elias crouched low, studying her. His instinct was to remain distant. To interfere meant taking on a burden that could cost him dearly. If she carried sickness, he might catch it. If her tribe found her with him, they might mistake his aid for harm. The wilderness had taught him a cruel lesson. Sometimes the kindest choice was to walk away, but something in her trembling form, the faint rise and fall of her chest against the snow, rooted him in place. This was not a woman long past saving. She was clinging, barely, to life. And Elias, despite the armor of solitude he had built around his soul, could not walk away. He knelt beside her, brushing snow from her face. Her eyes flickered open, dark and filled with pain. She whispered something, soft, broken syllables in her native tongue that Elias could not fully understand. Yet the meaning was clear enough. A plea for help. "Easy now," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. "You're not done yet, not today." She tried to lift a hand, but her strength failed. Elias slid his arms beneath her, lifting her carefully from the frozen ground. She was light, far too light, her frame weakened by hunger or illness. Her head rested against his chest as he rose to his feet, her shallow breaths fogging the air. The trek back to his cabin was slow and grueling. The snow thickened, swirling in sheets that blinded his path. Each step felt heavier, burdened not just by her weight, but by the awareness of what this choice might bring. Still, Elias pressed on, his breath steaming, boots crunching against the frozen earth, refusing to falter. At last, the faint outline of his cabin emerged through the storm. Smoke still curled from the chimney, promising warmth. He shouldered the door open with his boot and carried the woman inside, laying her gently upon the bed of furs by the fire. The room, sparse and simple, now felt like a sanctuary, its flickering firelight casting warmth over her pale, fragile face. Elias worked quickly. He fetched water from the pot simmering over the fire and pressed it to her lips, coaxing her to drink. Then he tore strips of clean cloth, tending to the cuts and bruises he found on her arms and legs. He wrapped her in heavy blankets, layering furs atop her trembling body to chase away the cold. Hours passed as the storm howled outside, but Elias remained at her side, feeding the fire, forcing her to sip broth he made from dried venison and roots. Her breaths grew steadier, though her eyes still flickered with fever. She murmured in her language, names, prayers, fragments of sorrow Elias could not understand. When at last her gaze met his with clarity, she spoke in broken English, her voice no stronger than a whisper. "My people, gone," Elias said. Nothing, only listened. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered again. "Husband, chief, dead. I left alone." The words struck Elias with quiet weight. She was not merely a woman of the tribe. She was the widow of a leader, left to die in the mountains with no family to protect her. A widow carrying both grief and the last breath of her people's honor. As the storm raged outside, Elias sat in silence, staring into the fire. He had taken in a stranger, but not just any stranger. This act of compassion, he knew, was not simple charity. It was a decision that would ripple far beyond his cabin wall. The storm did not let up through the night. It rattled the cabin's shutters, howled through the cracks in the logs, and piled snow high against the door. But inside, the fire roared, throwing golden light across the rough-hewn walls and the two figures huddled in its warmth. Elias sat in his chair, elbows on his knees, watching the native widow as she lay wrapped in furs on his bed. Her breathing had steadied, though it was shallow, fragile, like a flame that could be snuffed out with the slightest breath. Each time she stirred, Elias leaned closer, checking her pulse, forcing another sip of broth or water into her. He had tended to many wounds in his life, bullet holes from careless trappers, bear maulings, frostbite, even his own knife cuts when the mountains tested him. But this was different. Her body carried not just the marks of injury, but of neglect and sorrow. Hunger had hollowed her cheeks. Grief had weighed down her spirit. Elias knew the wilderness was merciless to those who bore their burdens alone. As the night wore on, the widow whispered in her tongue, fragments of memory tumbling from her fevered lips. Elias caught a word here, a name there, but much was lost. To him. Still, her tone told him enough. She had endured loss so deep that it bled into every dream. At one point, she reached out blindly, as if searching for someone in the dark. Without thinking, Elias took her hand, rough calluses meeting. Frail fingers. To his surprise, she gripped tightly, refusing to let go until exhaustion claimed her again. Elias sat back, unsettled. It had been years since another hand had touched his, years since he had let anyone so close. He reminded himself this was temporary, an act of decency, nothing more. By morning, he told himself, she might not even survive. But morning came, and she still breathed. When the storm finally broke, pale sunlight filtered through the frosted window. Elias rose stiffly, joints aching from a night without rest. He stoked the fire, then set about preparing something more nourishing. A stew from dried venison, beans, and a pinch of wild herbs. As the smell filled the cabin, the widow stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "You must eat," Elias said softly, bringing a bowl to her. Her hands trembled as she tried to lift it. Without a word, Elias steadied the bowl, spooning the broth carefully to her lips. She drank slowly, each swallow a battle, but she finished more than he expected. Color returned faintly to her cheeks. When he set the bowl aside, she whispered, "A word. Thank you." Elias nodded. He was not a man who sought thanks. Still, hearing those words from her, broken, halting, yet sincere, struck him more deeply than he cared to admit. The day passed in silence, broken only by the crack of the fire and the hiss of melting snow dripping from the roof. Elias tended to her wounds again, cleaning and binding them with fresh cloth. He ground medicinal roots he had gathered months before and brewed them into a bitter tea, coaxing her to drink it despite her grimace. Each task was done with the same care he gave his rifle or his traps, but now his focus was different. This was not about survival for himself. It was about giving someone else a chance to hold on to life. At dusk, she spoke again, her English broken but clearer. "My name, Ahyoka." Elias nodded once more, storing the name away like a precious thing. He did not tell her his name, not yet. Names carried weight, and he was not sure if he was ready to bear it again. That night, she slept more peacefully. Elias, however, lay awake on the floor beside the fire, staring into the flames. The mountains had hardened him, taught him to avoid attachments. Out here, attachments could get you killed. Yet he had chosen, against his instincts, to bring her into his home, to fight for her life when nature and circumstance had already written her off. It wasn't just pity. He knew that now. Something deeper had stirred, a recognition, perhaps, of shared loneliness. He lived each day in silence, cut off from kin, just as she now drifted in the void left by her lost people. Maybe, in some unspoken way, saving her was also saving a part of himself he thought long dead. As the fire crackled and the wind outside softened into silence, Elias made a silent vow. He would keep her alive, not because he expected anything in return, not because it would bring him glory, but because kindness, rare and fragile in a world like this, was worth protecting. And though he did not yet know it, this act of kindness would not remain hidden. By helping Ahyoka, Elias had unknowingly lit a signal fire in the heart of the mountains. Others would see it soon, others would come, and when they did, they would not come quietly. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm Elias had not known for years. He was no longer living only for himself. Every morning, every chore, every decision carried the weight of another fragile life. Ahyoka's strength returned slowly, like embers coaxed back into flame. She ate what she could, slept deeply, and sometimes, when the pain in her body eased, she spoke. At first, her words were scattered, short phrases in broken English, some in her native tongue that Elias only half understood. But gradually, the fragments formed a picture. It was not just her body that had been battered by the mountains. It was her soul. One evening, after a day of weak sunlight and sharp winds, Elias sat at the fire sharpening his knife. Ahyoka rested on the bed of furs, her face illuminated by the firelight. Her eyes, once dulled by fever, now carried depth, though sorrow still lingered in them like a shadow that refused to leave. "My husband," she began softly, her voice halting as though each word cost her effort. Elias looked up but said nothing, giving her the silence she needed to continue. "He was chief, a strong man, brave." She paused, eyes glistening. "Our people honor him, protect them, he did. But sickness came, took many." Her gaze drifted to the flames, as if she could see faces there, faces of loved ones swallowed by fate. "Husband fell ill, medicine failed, he gone Then enemies came. Elias frowned slightly. Enemies? She nodded weakly. Another band. Warriors from Far Valley. They saw us. Weak. They struck. Many killed. Others scattered. Her voice trembled. I ran. No family left. Alone. The words hit Elias like a cold wind. He had seen this story before, though with different names, different tribes, different villages. The frontier was merciless, not only in its storms and predators, but in men. Tribes warring against tribes, settlers pushing into lands, soldiers marching with iron and fire. It was all the same endless cycle. The strong pressed upon the weak, and the weak vanished like smoke in the wind. For Ayoka, survival was no victory. It was an exile. You have no one? Elias asked quietly. Her eyes met his then, dark, searching, carrying the weight of a woman who had lost more than one life could bear. She shook her head slowly. No one. Husband gone. People scattered. Widow. Empty. The word lingered between them. Widow. It was more than a title. It was a scar. It meant she bore the weight of her husband's legacy, yet carried it alone. In her people's eyes, she was not just a grieving wife. She was the last thread to a leader whose blood and spirit demanded honor. Ayoka closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. I prayed. For death in snow, easier. But you find me. You give me fire again. Elias shifted uneasily in his chair. He was not used to being thanked, much less revered. He had acted out of instinct, nothing more. Yet hearing her words stirred something in him. It was not pride, but a deep awareness that he had stepped into something larger than himself. Saving her was not like saving a wounded trapper or a lost traveler. This woman carried with her the memory of an entire people. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the fire's crackle. Elias's thoughts drifted to his own past, the ghosts he never spoke of. Once, long ago, he too had carried loss. A family left behind, a war that had stolen brothers in arms, a journey westward that had cost him every bond he once had. He knew what it meant to be emptied out by grief, to walk as a shadow in a world that no longer seemed to want him. Perhaps that was why he had not left her in the snow. Perhaps in saving Ayoka, he was reaching back through time, grasping at a redemption he had never thought possible. That night, before sleep took her, Ayoka whispered one more truth, her voice fragile but certain. My people. If they live, they honor him still. My husband. They would honor you too for saving his wife. Elias did not respond. He stared into the flames, jaw tight, wrestling with the unease curling in his gut. He had wanted no part of tribes, no part of their politics or wars. He lived apart for a reason. But Ayoka's words hung heavy, like storm clouds waiting to break. Because if her people did still live, if word reached them of what he had done, his solitude would not last. Her rescue was not a hidden act. It was a spark that might call others. And Elias knew the wilderness well enough to understand. Fire always draws eyes, and sometimes it draws armies. That night, the wind shifted. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle silence that was more unsettling than the howling blizzard itself. The mountains seemed to hold their breath. Even the pines outside stood motionless, their branches heavy with snow, as though the whole wilderness was waiting for something unseen. Inside the cabin, the firelight flickered softly over the log walls. Ayoka slept deeply, her breathing steadier now, her face calm beneath the shadows of exhaustion. Wrapped in furs, she looked less like a widow at the edge of death and more like a survivor reclaiming her strength. But Elias could not rest. He sat by the fire with his rifle across his lap, his knife gleaming faintly at his side. His eyes stayed on the door and windows, every sense sharpened by years of survival. The wilderness was never silent without reason. Silence meant predators. Silence meant danger. All day the mountains had given him no sign of life, no deer, tracks in the snow, no calls of birds, no distant howl of wolves. To a man who knew the land as well as Elias did, such absence was a warning. Something stirred out there, something closer than it should be. He rose quietly, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The cold struck his face like a slap, his breath fogging instantly. The snow crunched under his boots as he scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The moon hung pale behind a thin veil of clouds, casting just enough light to make the world appear, carved from silver. Then he heard it. A crack. Not the fall of snow from a branch, not the shift of ice. This was sharper. A deliberate step. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the rifle. His eyes narrowed as he swept the dark line of trees. For a moment, all was still again. Then another sound, softer, distant, but unmistakable. The howl of a wolf, but not one wolf, several. The pack was near. Elias backed toward the cabin slowly, his rifle raised, scanning the shadows. He knew the wolves of this valley. They were bold in winter, their hunger driving them to test even strong prey. A dying woman, weak and unable to defend herself, would be an easy prize. He slipped inside the cabin, shutting the door firmly and bolting it with the heavy timber bar he had carved years ago. The fire cast a stronger glow now, filling the room with warmth. Ayoka stirred faintly, but did not wake. Elias set more wood on the fire, then moved to the window. Outside, dark shapes drifted between the trees, low and fluid, eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. The wolves had come. He checked his powder horn and primed his rifle. A single shot would drop one, but the sound might draw others from farther down the valley. Wolves traveled in numbers. Where there were 3, there could be 10. For hours, the pack circled. Their eyes appeared and vanished in the darkness, weaving through the snow like spirits. They howled, long and mournful, their cries echoing against the ridges. It was no random hunt. Elias knew they were testing him, gauging his strength, waiting for weakness. He stayed by the fire, rifle steady, eyes never leaving the window. He would not let them near the cabin, not tonight, not while Ahioka slept. At one point, a scratching sound came against the back wall, claws scraping wood. Elias was on his feet in an instant, stepping to the door, finger tight on the trigger. The sound stopped. Silence followed. Then, as if in mockery, a deep howl rose from just beyond the clearing. Elias exhaled slowly. His jaw tightened. The wolves would not breach his walls, not while he was alive. As the hours crawled past, exhaustion tugged at him, but he forced himself awake. He brewed bitter coffee over the fire and sat with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the window. Each flicker of shadow kept his heart sharp, his hand steady. Near dawn, the howls faded. The eyes vanished from the tree line. The pack had withdrawn, leaving only silence in their wake. Elias allowed himself a long breath. Lowering the rifle, he turned to check on Ayoka. She still slept, her face soft in the glow of the fire, unaware of the danger that had pressed so close. For the first time in years, Elias realized he had something worth guarding, not just out of instinct, not just for survival, but for its own sake. Protecting her was no longer a burden. It was a vow. As the first pale light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, Elias remained at his post, weary but resolute. He had kept vigil through the night, guarding against the wilderness itself. But in the quiet hours before sunrise, another thought gnawed at him. Wolves were not the only predators in these mountains. There were men, too, tribes, bands, wanderers, soldiers. And unlike wolves, Men carried memory. Men carried vengeance. He had saved Ayoka from the snow. He had guarded her from the wolves. But Elias knew the greatest test was still ahead, and it would not come quietly in the night. The sun rose pale and reluctant, as if even the heavens hesitated to break the silence of the night just past. Snow glittered across the valley like a field of white fire, untouched except for the faint tracks of wolves that had circled the cabin. Elias stood at the door, rifle in hand, his breath fogging in the brittle air. He scanned the ridges, the dark timber line, the creek frozen stiff below. Nothing moved. For now, the wilderness had retreated. Inside, the fire still glowed in the hearth, its warmth filling the one-room cabin. Ahyoka stirred beneath the furs, her eyelids fluttering open. When her gaze found Elias by the door, a faint smile touched her lips, small, weak, but real. "You stayed awake," she whispered, her voice rasped with sleep. Elias set his rifle aside and shrugged off the remark. "Wolves don't sleep at night. Someone had to watch." She pushed herself. Up slowly, the movement still heavy with weakness. Her dark eyes searched his face for a long moment, and then she lowered her head. "You guard me, like family." The words settled heavy in the air. Elias busied himself with the fire, breaking apart kindling to avoid her eyes. He wasn't. A man who knew what to do with gratitude. Solitude had been his companion so long that simple kindness felt unnatural, as if it didn't belong to him anymore. But Ayoka did not let the silence stand. She reached for the cup of broth he set before her, sipping carefully. When she had finished, she placed her hand lightly on his rough, calloused one. "You save me. From snow. From death. From wolves." Her voice trembled, but her gaze was steady. "My husband was chief. He gave much to his people. He protected them always. Now he gone. I thought I go too. But you—" She drew in a slow breath. "You give me life again. That is, gift no words can hold." Elias sat back, uneasy under the weight of her sincerity. He had expected nothing, no thanks, no bond, only the quiet satisfaction that came from doing what a man ought to do. But the way she spoke, the reverence in her tone, unsettled him. "You don't owe me anything," he said gruffly. Ayoka shook, her head, her tangled hair brushing her shoulders. "I owe you everything. In my people's way, a life saved is a bond made. You are brother, protector, friend. You cannot be stranger now." Elias let the words linger, unsure how to answer. He had lived too long in the silence of the mountains, where men were enemies or allies for trade, nothing more. Bonds to him meant risk. They meant a tether that could be pulled, a weakness to be exploited. Yet here was a woman who had nothing left, offering him something greater than survival: trust. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly, filling the space between them. When Ayoka finally broke the silence, her voice carried the weight of a blessing. She whispered words in her tongue, melodic and low, almost like a prayer. Though Elias could not understand, he felt the reverence in her tone, the way each syllable wrapped around him like the smoke of sage on the wind. When she finished, she met his eyes. "I bless you, mountain man. Spirits see what you do. My people, if they knew, they honor you. Warriors bow their heads for such kindness." Elias shifted in his chair, discomforted. He didn't seek honor. He didn't want warriors bowing. At his door. All he wanted was to live quietly, apart from the struggles of men. Yet deep inside, something stirred, a part of him long buried beneath years of solitude. To be remembered, to be honored, to matter. He pushed the thought away. "Eat more," he muttered, standing. "You'll need strength." Ayoka smiled faintly, the first true smile he had seen from her. Strength will come, because of you. As the day passed, her recovery became more visible. She sat longer by the fire, her cheeks gaining color, her hands steadier with each meal. She spoke more, telling him of the songs her people sang, of the plains they once hunted, of the laughter of children now scattered to the winds. Her voice carried both grief and beauty, and Elias listened quietly, saying little but absorbing much. That night, as the stars shimmered cold above the peaks, Elias lay on the floor by the fire, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Ayoka rested peacefully on the bed, her breathing even, her strength slowly returning. Before he closed his eyes, he heard her whisper once more, thinking he had already drifted to sleep. "You are not alone, Elias Crow. Not anymore." His heart tightened at the sound of his name on her lips. He had never told her. The fire crackled, and Elias lay awake, staring at the rafters above. Somehow she had known. Somehow she saw more of him than he had wanted revealed, and though he could not yet admit it, the bond had been sealed. Her gratitude was no fleeting word. It was a tether, one that would soon draw others to his door. The following morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of winter dawn where the mountains seemed carved from glass. The air glittered with frost, and the silence was so deep Elias could hear the creek groaning beneath its armor of ice. He stepped outside to fetch water, his rifle slung across his shoulder out of habit. The snow crunched under his boots as he approached the frozen creek, his breath streaming like smoke in the bitter air. The stillness was uncanny, too still. He had learned long ago that the wilderness always spoke, whether in the chatter of birds, the crack of branches, or the distant cry of predators. But this morning, it gave nothing. A prickle ran down Elias's spine. Something was coming. He scanned the tree line, eyes narrowing. For a long moment, there was nothing but white, silence and dark pines. Then he heard it, faint at first, a low, steady rhythm. Not the call of nature, but the sound of men. Drums. Elias froze, heart tightening. The sound rolled across the valley like distant thunder, slow and measured, carrying authority. Alongside it came another sound, the heavy beat of hooves. Horses. Many horses. He turned sharply, striding back toward the cabin. Inside, Ayoka sat near the fire, weaving her thin fingers through the fringe of a blanket. She looked up at once, sensing his urgency. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still soft but stronger than before. Elias's jaw clenched. "Riders. A lot of them." Her eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. She rose unsteadily, moving, to the window. The sound was louder now, the rhythm of drums joined by the distant snort and stamp of horses, the creak of leather, the unmistakable murmur of voices carried on the wind. "They come," she whispered. Her tone was not of surprise, but of certainty, as if she had been waiting for this moment. Elias checked the rifle leaning against the wall, ensuring it was loaded. Then he set it aside. Against wolves, a rifle was enough. Against men, 200. Of them, if his ears did not lie, it was folly. Ayoka turned to him, her eyes fierce despite her frailty. "Do not fear. They are my husband's people." Elias frowned. 200 warriors riding with war drums, and you tell me not to fear." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, steadying him. "They come not for war against you. They come for me. They will see what you have done. They will know." Outside, the sound grew thunderous. Snow shook from the pines as the rhythm filled the valley. Elias stepped to the door, unbolted it, and pushed it open. What he saw froze him in place. From the far ridge, a column of riders poured into the valley, their horses kicking up snow in great plumes. At their head rode warriors painted in bright colors, feathers streaming from their hair, spears and bows gleaming in the pale light. Their faces were stern, unreadable, marked with the pride of a people who had endured loss yet carried themselves with unbroken strength. Behind them stretched ranks upon ranks, dozens, then scores, then hundreds. The riders fanned out across the valley floor, their sheer presence overwhelming the quiet wilderness. The ground trembled beneath the hooves, the air pulsed with the beat of drums. Elias had faced storms, predators, and even men with rifles, but never had he seen such a sight, an army of warriors filling the land like a tide of living flame. He stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, watching them approach. For the first time in years, a flicker of unease, not from wolves or hunger, but from men, stirred in his chest. Ayoka appeared beside him, leaning on the doorframe for support. Her eyes glistened with tears, though her voice was steady. "They come for me, for their chief's wife." Elias glanced at her. "And for the man who pulled her from the snow." The riders slowed as they neared the cabin, their leader raising a hand. The drums ceased, leaving only the heavy snorting of horses and the creak of leather. 200 pairs of eyes fixed on Elias Crow, the solitary mountain man who now stood between them and their widow. For a long heartbeat, silence reigned. Snow drifted gently from the branches above, the world holding its breath. Then, from the front line, a warrior dismounted. He approached slowly, his steps deliberate, his gaze never leaving Elias. He carried no weapon in his hand, only the weight of his presence. Ayoka whispered, her voice trembling, "They will honor you." But Elias, his heart steady, his face unreadable, knew that honor from such men was not given lightly. It was earned, and it could change everything. The unexpected arrival had come. The mountain was no longer silent. The valley had never known such silence. 200 warriors sat astride their horses, breath steaming in the cold air, eyes fixed on the lone cabin where Elias and Ayoka stood. Their painted faces were as unreadable as the peaks towering above them, eyes like flint, jaws set with the hardness of men who lived by steel and blood. Elias felt the weight of it press upon him, heavier than any storm. He had hunted elk, faced down grizzlies, and walked into blizzards that swallowed men whole. Yet never had he stood before such a sight, an army of horsemen, each one trained from boyhood to fight and die without hesitation. Against them, his rifle was little more than a twig in a river. The leader stepped forward. He was tall, broad of shoulder, his chest bare despite the biting cold, painted with bold red streaks that marked him as a man of high standing. His hair, black as midnight, was braided with feathers that danced in the breeze. In one hand, he carried a long spear tipped with obsidian, its edge glittering like ice. He stopped a dozen paces from Elias, snow crunching under his moccasins. His gaze shifted past the mountain man, landing on Ayoka. The recognition was immediate. His eyes softened, and he dropped to one knee, pressing his fist to his chest in a gesture of respect. A murmur swept through the ranks behind him. Warriors dismounted one after another until the ground seemed to quake under the weight of so many boots. They stood shoulder to shoulder, spears upright, heads bowed, not in defeat, but in solemn honor. Elias glanced at Ayoka. She had tears streaming down her cheeks, her frail body trembling. For the first time since he'd found her in the snow, she stood tall, pride shining through the grief etched into her face. She stepped forward, her hand brushing Elias's arm as if to steady him, though her own legs wavered. "My husband's people," she whispered. "They honor his widow, and the one who saved her." The leader rose slowly, his gaze returning to Elias. For a moment the silence pressed again, heavier than before. Then he spoke, in a deep, steady voice that rolled across the valley like thunder. You are the man who carried the chief's wife from death." His English was clear but thick with accent. Elias inclined his head. Ayoka was dying. I did what was needed. The warrior studied him with a long, piercing look. No man of the mountains does such a thing for nothing. I didn't do it for nothing, Elias replied, his voice even. I did it because it was right. Another murmur rippled through the crowd, this one softer, like a current beneath still water. The leader turned to Ayoka. She nodded, her voice fragile yet strong. He saved me, fed me, guarded me through the night. Without him, I would have gone to my husband's spirit long ago. The warrior's jaw tightened, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he lowered his spear and drove its tip into the snow, leaving it upright like a marker. Behind him, one by one, 200 warriors did the same. The valley filled with the sound of wood striking earth, a forest of spears rising from the snow like a field of solemn trees. Elias felt his breath catch. He had never seen such a sight, nor understood its meaning. Ayoka, tears glistening on her cheeks, whispered the answer. It is the highest honor. They mark you as brother. They would bleed beside you, mountain man. The leader stepped forward again, this time extending his hand. Elias hesitated, glancing at the sea of warriors surrounding him. He had spent years keeping away from men, carving his solitude into the bones of the wilderness. And now, in a single gesture of kindness, he had been bound to a people who carried the strength of nations. Finally, he clasped the leader's forearm. The warrior's grip was strong, unyielding, filled with the weight of centuries of tradition. Elias, "Crow," the leader said, his voice carrying so that all could hear. "From this day, your name rides with us. You are not stranger. You are not outsider. You are brother." The warriors thundered their approval, striking fists to their chests. In unison, the sound rolled across the valley like the beating of a single, massive heart. Elias stood still, the echo washing over him. For a man who had sought silence his whole life, it was deafening. Yet somewhere deep inside, he felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. A bond had been forged, one he hadn't sought, but one he could not deny. The sea of warriors had spoken. The mountain man no longer stood alone. The valley still echoed with the warriors' thunderous salute, their fists striking against their chests like drums of the earth itself. Elias stood in the doorway of his cabin, Ayoka beside him, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of other men's eyes not as a threat but as something heavier, expectation. The leader of the warriors held Elias's forearm a moment longer before releasing it. He stepped back and motioned to two younger men. They moved forward, steadying Ayoka and guiding her toward the center of the gathered ranks. Elias watched, uncertain, until the leader turned back to him. "She is more than widow," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "She is the last living flame of our chief. Her life is our bond, our memory, our honor. Without her, the spirit of our people is weaker. You carried her when even the wolves circled. You gave her back to us. Do you understand?" Elias's jaw tightened. He wanted to shrug it off, to say it was nothing, just another act of survival. But the look in the warrior's eyes told him such words would be a lie here. He glanced at Ayoka, now standing amid her people, her head bowed, her fragile form upheld by their strength. She no longer looked like the fading widow he had found in the snow. She looked like the heart of something far greater. "I understand," Elias said finally. His voice was low, but it carried. The leader nodded once, gravely. "Then you must also understand this. From this day, you are tied to us, not by blood, but by spirit. Our chief died with honor. You preserved his honor by saving the one he left behind. His spirit looks upon you now." A hush fell across the ranks of warriors. Elias felt it sink into him like the stillness before a storm. He had lived his life alone, with no ties but to the mountains and the seasons. Now, these men were telling him he had become part of their story, whether he willed it or not. Ayoka raised her head. Her eyes found Elias, shimmering with gratitude, and something deeper, faith. My husband often said a man's greatness is not measured by the blood he sheds, but by the lives he preserves. You have proven his words true. Her voice cracked, but her spirit did not falter. She lifted a hand toward Elias, beckoning him forward. Slowly, hesitantly, he stepped into the circle of warriors. The snow beneath his boots crunched, loud in the silence. The leader gestured, and from among the ranks a warrior emerged, carrying a bundle wrapped in hide. He approached Elias and unwrapped it, revealing a cloak of thick fur, lined with beadwork and feathers. He held it high, then draped it over Elias's shoulders. The weight was heavy, warm, alive with meaning. This was the cloak of our chief, the leader said. We give it to you not as chief but as brother. You will carry his memory with us. Elias stood stiff, the cloak pressing down on him like the burden of mountains. He was no leader, no hero, just a man who had chosen not to walk past death when he found it in the snow. And yet here, among these warriors, that choice had become something larger. He looked around at their faces, stern, proud, unyielding. Not one held doubt in their eyes. To them, the act that had come so naturally to him had become a bond no weapon could break. The leader spoke again, his voice solemn. 200 warriors stand before you. If you call, we answer. If you fall, we avenge. If you live, we live with you. That is our vow. The words struck Elias harder than any rifle shot. He had not asked for this. He had not sought a tribe, a family, or the weight of brotherhood. Yet here it was, placed upon his shoulders with all the gravity of the snow-laden peaks. For a long moment, Elias said nothing. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the smoke from his chimney, the scent of pine and fire. He looked at Ayoka, at the warriors, at the cloak now resting upon him. Finally, he gave a slow nod. Then I will carry it. Not for me, for her, for the man she lost, for the people he left behind. A deep murmur of approval rose from the warriors, a sound like the rumble of a mountain settling after an avalanche. Ayoka closed her eyes, tears falling freely, but her smile was radiant. In that moment, Elias Crow, the solitary mountain man who had once chosen silence and solitude, stood at the heart of a people's memory. The moment of truth had come, and he had not turned away. The snow in the valley had begun to ease, the storm clouds drifting away as if the mountains themselves wished to bear witness to what had taken place. Elias Crow stood beneath the open sky, the fur cloak heavy upon his shoulders, his cabin behind him, and before him 200 warriors who had declared him their brother. For a long time he remained still, listening to the strange quiet that followed their vow. It was not the silence of isolation he had grown used to. It was the silence of respect, a living silence filled with meaning. Ayoka stepped closer to him, her frail body leaning on the arm of a young warrior. She reached out, fingers brushing the cloak. He would be proud, she whispered, her voice trembling. My husband. He would say the spirits led you to me so that our people might remember the goodness still alive in this world. Elias swallowed hard. He had never thought of himself as a man led by spirits or destiny. He lived by instinct, by grit, by the raw struggle of surviving in places where most men would freeze, starve, or go mad. And yet here he stood, chosen not by desire, but by deed, tied to a people whose blood and history ran deeper than the roots of the pines around them. The leader of the warriors approached once more, his voice carrying like the roll of thunder. Elias Crow, Mountain Man. From this day forward, when our children speak of the winter that tried to break us, they will remember the man who defied death to save what remained of our chief's line. You may walk your path alone, but know this, you will never be without us. The words struck him harder than any bullet. For years, Elias had believed that to be alone was to be safe. Safe from betrayal, safe from loss, safe from the cruel hands of fate that had taken so much from him before he fled into the wilderness. But now, looking at the faces around him, painted warriors, stoic and unyielding, bound by honor, he realized something he had forgotten long ago. To be remembered was its own kind of survival. He gave a short nod, the only gesture he could trust himself with. "I'll not forget this day," he said quietly, "nor the promise that comes with it." The leader placed a hand over his heart and inclined his head. One by one, the warriors followed, 200 men bowing slightly, to the mountain man, the gesture not of subservience but of shared respect. The valley trembled with their unity, the air alive with the power of their acknowledgement. Then, as suddenly as they had come, the warriors began to mount their horses again. Spears were lifted, drums stilled, and the great gathering prepared to ride. A yoke was placed gently upon a strong pony, wrapped in blankets, her eyes never leaving Elias as she was settled among her people. "You gave me back to them," she said softly. "But you also gave yourself back to something you thought you'd lost. Remember that." Her words lingered as the warriors began to move, their horses' hooves striking the snow in rhythmic unison. The great column wound its way out of the valley, a living river of strength and memory, until only the sound of their departure remained. Elias stood in the doorway of his cabin, the fur cloak still about his shoulders, and watched until they were gone. The silence that followed was different than any silence he had ever known. It was not empty. It was full of promise, full of remembrance, full of the echo of voices that had called him brother. Elias turned back into his cabin, the fire still glowing, the scent of pine and smoke thick in the air. He placed the cloak upon the chair near the hearth, staring at it for a long time. He knew that from this day forward, his solitude was no longer absolute. Somewhere beyond the mountains, 200 warriors carried his name with them. Somewhere, in the heart of a people, his act of kindness had become a story, and though he would return to his life of hunting, trapping, and wandering, he would never again be only a shadow among the pines. He was Elias Crow, the mountain man who saved a dying widow, the man who, for a single act of compassion, stood before 200 warriors and walked away not alone, but honored. The snow continued to fall lightly, soft as feathers, covering the tracks of the horses that had filled the valley. Elias stepped outside once more, gazing at the vast peaks around him. For the first time in years, he smiled, because he knew, in the deep silence of the wilderness, that he was no longer forgotten. He was part of something greater than himself, and that was a legacy no winter could ever bury.